We welcome you to this session, this practice session, coordinated by WRI. My name is Cecilia Perales. The name of this session is Participatory Science, Promoting Actions for Clean Air, and the goal of today is to explore alongside you the value of the citizenry participation in order to come up with technical and scientific tools that help us assess and address environmental problems such as air pollution. Our panel for today is made up mainly by women and colleagues from WRI living in different countries and in different areas. Firstly, we're going to have Elizabeth Moses, who's a specialist in environmental rights, and we're going to hear Robin King, who is a coordinator of WRI. They're going to talk about citizenry actions in order to address air pollution as well as the collection of data in order to promote more equitable cities. In the midst of the session, we're going to have a Q&A session so that we can hear the comments, and it is going to be moderated by Itza Castañeda. We'll also hear some local experiences coming from León, Guanajuato, and Guadalajara, Jalisco. And to close this session, Beatriz Cárdenas is going to share some final reflections and some conclusions we've reached today. So firstly, we have Elizabeth Moses, who is the assignee for rights and environmental justice. So please go ahead, Elizabeth. We give you the floor.
All right, there we go. So again, hello. Thank you so much for having me. Good morning and good afternoon. Today, I'm going to be presenting some key insights from a working paper that's about to be released in the next couple of weeks called Clean Air Action: Applications of Citizen Science to Identify and Address Air Pollution Emission Sources. But before I jump into the sort of paper insights, I want to just frame this a little bit. I'm going to be speaking about the citizen part of citizen science. As I'm sure you're all aware, there's a wide range of definitions of citizen science, the goals and the objectives of each initiative, the degree of citizen engagement, how and what data is collected and used varies by specific academic discipline and really by researcher and citizen engagement preference. So related to this, WRI is working on a large USAID funded project called the Clean Air Catalyst. And the theory of change behind this project is to really focus on source awareness and really looking at how we can focus attention on the specific sources versus describing ambient air quality, with the understanding that that will really be unlocking new opportunities for clean air action. So, as I was saying, the lack of source awareness is an important topic because most citizen science initiatives really characterize ambient air quality, the collecting of data on pollutant levels that describe really how bad air pollution is. And while the understanding is obviously very important, the lack of a clear shared understanding of where pollution comes from, the relevant sources of emissions that limit the ability of regulators and affected communities to take action that directs targets the sources of air pollution in their community is really an important element that really is going to ensure that people can build pressure for policies that hold specific polluters accountable to legal limits or best practices. Next slide, please. So this is where my research comes in. I conducted a literature review that focused on how citizen science initiatives investigate the sources of air pollution. After a thorough search, I identified 33 case studies to review and developed a framework for evaluation that really looked at the stakeholders involved, the project goal and implementation plan, the sources of pollution that were investigated, participatory science approaches, and the outcomes that were achieved. Next slide. So let me just quickly go over what I found. First, obviously, a wide range of pollutants are being investigated through citizen science, including nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide and monoxide, particulate matter, of course, black carbon, ozone, hydrogen sulfide, methane, formaldehyde, and other VOCs. Most of these source pollutants were really from transportation-based or stationary emission sources, either suspected or known to be a major source of exposure. You can also see that there were a wide range of monitoring approaches used, and there was also a wide range of stated citizen science objectives across the cases, although strengthening public awareness and knowledge around air quality was a key goal of all of the studies that I reviewed. Next slide. So let's go through some of the insights that I were able to capture from this analysis. The first is that the use of citizen science, especially focused on emissions from specific sources, is really limited in low and middle income countries. I was able to find one study in Kenya and another study in Myanmar. Most of the studies were from US and Europe or Canada. This might not really be surprising given the documented trends that citizen science is typically used more in developed countries. The next slide, please. Second, it was able to identify that there were really two main ways that sources were targeted in these citizen science initiatives. 15 of the studies really focused on sources of a known air pollutions and point source, such as oil or mining sites, a steel refinery, waste piles, hog operations, previously identified air pollution hotspots, maybe associated with high density traffic or a group of industrial facilities. And these studies really looked at these point sources using three sort of general themes. The first was really around social equity and personal exposure. So really understanding where pollutant monitoring data could be linked with citizen health advisory and health experiences dealing with those sources. They also looked at temporal spaces, temporal and spatial patterns rather, characterizing the emissions from a particular area. And they also looked at policy input and oversight, investigation into regulatory compliance or additional needed regulatory action based on the exposure and emissions characterization. The second approach seen in 9 studies was to investigate insights into potential sources of emissions associated with exposure in specific geographic areas. In these cases, researchers leveraged hyperlocal monitoring to further characterize the sources presented in an area or used community knowledge and access in the local community to identify new sources that hadn't been captured by regulatory monitoring. For these studies, I want to flag that citizen surveys, focus groups, and workshops were commonly used to capture those citizen insights and opinions, and that this method really helped shape the monitoring methodology and informed how the data could be used. Next slide. Third, of the 33 case studies I looked at, only 2 incorporated actual source apportionment analysis. The data did help connect regulatory action to sources of community concern and highlighted the need for further investigation, which was mentioned in a few studies as an important next step. It was never really explicitly stated in the case studies, but I do suspect that the time and expense of source apportionment modeling and chemical analysis played a role in why so few of the studies could take this extra step. Fourth, citizen engagement and air quality monitoring efforts was really driven by community concerns around health and disease burdens. High asthma and other respiratory disease rates were the focus in 10 studies, cardiovascular diseases in 4 studies, and cancer risk in 5 studies. In some cases, air pollution community concerns were based on sensory perceptions like bad smells. This included an explicit environmental justice framing in 11 of the US-based studies, including the 6 initiatives from California, which I think reflects a growing trend in citizen science initiatives. So the fifth really was that there were multiple pathways were used to achieve outcomes, and most of the studies used more than one of these pathways. So let's just quickly review them. The first was really sustaining attention to the pollution source. The initiatives really raised community level awareness around sources of pollution, and that included efforts to improve the understanding of environmental health, maybe associated with the specific pollutant levels and their personal exposure. Sustained attention was also strengthened through the tools and platforms that were used, the print and social media engagement, or the public awareness raising activities that were conducted by both the scientific and the citizen project leaders. They also were able to engage with policymakers and decision makers. They either leveraged or created forums for engagement with these decision makers about community concerns, and they really essentially created a place where they could showcase the evidence that they were able to collect through the citizen science initiative. They also were able to really activate communities and really spur interest in continuing to work with researchers to collect more data and information about the sources of air pollution. And that really even included creating lasting networks and partnerships with scientific researchers. They were also able to collect the data that they used to disproportionate impacts and to target policy reforms or stronger enforcement measures. And that included documenting violations of pollution limits and the evidence that was required to really need stronger health protection measures. This also included highlighting new evidence, including the discovery of actually new important hyperlocal emission sources that were likely an important source of community exposure. And finally, they were really able to elicit behavior change. So many of the studies hoped to change the behavior of the participant or the local community, and they were able to document people stopped using their cars and maybe used walking or bicycling more. In one of the other examples, they were able to actually modify the sort of walking routes that they would use to avoid some of the high emission hotspots that they were able to document in their community. Sixth insight is really about the outcomes that were achieved. Most of the case studies documented more public attention to air pollution, a deeper participant awareness of the technical and scientific issues surrounding air quality, and an increased capacity to speak about and engage policymakers with their concerns. Formal multi-stakeholder networks, as I mentioned, were also formed in a number of the cases. But for the initiatives that focused on sources, the participants were specifically able to really expand the recognition of new sources. They were really able to spur stronger enforcement or develop new control policies associated with specific sources that had been targeted in the citizen science initiative. And they were actually, in some cases, actually able to spur stronger compliance or new mitigation action by the polluting companies directly. Two of the most important reasons for these successes are what you see on the screen. They really were able to document that the successful examples were really when community-based leaders had a very clear objective and plan for how they were going to use the data that was going to be collected. And also that it was focused on the examples where researchers and communities took the time to build trust and a vision for co-leadership. So Of course, with all citizen science initiatives, the examples that I was able to highlight were not without challenges. These included the time and the effort it took to really deepen community technical knowledge of air pollution that really needed, that was to understand what the monitoring was going to be, what it could say, how it was going to be done, and why it was going to be done the way it was. Also, there were a lot of broad enabling obstacles that prevented regulators or polluters from taking action based on the data, which I think was very disheartening to many of the community participants. And finally, especially in the environmental justice framed studies, the fact that citizen science still doesn't provide a clear causal relationship or link between the health impacts and pollutants limited is, sort of what they could do from an advocacy point of view based on the citizen science data. So bringing this all together, essentially I created a typology that really summarizes how citizen science initiatives are addressing the sources of specific emissions. It really outlines the two main approaches and the 6 pathways that are used to change outcomes that I just was able to describe. While a lot of this might not be radically different than all air pollutant studies involving citizen science, I really do hope this typology will, number one, really help future researchers and others think about how to tackle source awareness through citizen science. And I think that this approach also really helps reinforce why citizen science data collection is so beneficial to policymakers, researchers, and local communities. So let me just end with some final thoughts. The first really is that obviously, based on this review, I think there's really even more opportunities to leverage citizen science initiatives to expand issues around source awareness. If part of the challenge of getting people to act on the ambient air quality challenges is that people don't really understand where that air pollution is coming from, then I think citizen science is a really important way to engage local people in a way that directly expands their understanding of those sources of pollution and will hopefully give them this specific and targeted information that they need to really strengthen their engagement with policymakers and as well as take specific behavioral action themselves or within their community. The second sort of key concluding remark I wanted to highlight is really the need to develop targeted strategies in low and middle income countries. There just isn't the uptake in citizen science in low and middle income countries compared to other developed countries. And I think that this is really an important area for focus. But there's a number of sort of specific challenges that I think would have to be addressed in order to sort of raise the profile of citizen science. And you can see those on the screen as well. The first really is about addressing some of the institutional capacity and coordination issues that really might make it difficult for decision makers and policy leaders to think about citizen science data and how useful it can be in their policy making approach. Access to technology and equipment is a huge challenge for all citizen science initiatives, but of course there are specific challenges in certain countries that would need to be overcome. There's also a real need to socialize or really develop uptake strategies with both scientists and policymakers who might be unaccustomed to citizen science and citizen engagement in technical kind of research, and really helping to bring them along to understand the benefits, I think, is an important element. Also, as part of this, it's really making sure that researchers and citizen groups are really understanding the cultural barriers, including potential gender barriers that really could inhibit the ability of citizens to be engaged in citizen science initiatives, and really map that out ahead of time so that specific strategies can be addressed to overcome those barriers. And then finally, I think it's incredibly important to define environmental justice approaches for low and middle income countries. Environmental justice very much is a US and Western based concept, but it really is characterizing an incredibly important reality for low income and marginalized communities across the globe. They face disproportionate impact from air pollution, and they really need targeted strategies to help overcome the historical instructional barriers that really are causing them to both be disproportionately exposed to air pollution and also limiting their ability to adapt or address these air pollution. So really beginning to expand environmental justice in that global context and using citizen science as a key mechanism for that, I think is really a very important next step. And with that, I just want to thank you.
Now we're going to move on to Robin King's presentation, who is the Director of Knowledge Capture and Collaboration at WRI. She's going to share a perspective related to participatory science, and she's going to talk about data collection and engaging with the right sectors. Go ahead, Robin. Okay, so I'm going to be giving the presentation in English, okay?
Let me share my screen and hopefully it will. So I am going to speak on something that's a bit wider than what Liz mentioned and talked about, although I will make linkages between the two talks. I will present two pieces of a much broader piece of work on 7 transformations towards more equitable and sustainable cities. This is the culmination of over 6 years of research where we developed a roadmap for successful cities, really trying to look at how cities can become more equitable and sustainable through the lens of access to core urban services. We did 7 thematic papers and 7 case studies. Several of the cities that we did case studies on actually are present here today, so I'm very excited about that. And then we pulled all of that together over the last couple of years in the synthesis report. And in that synthesis report, what we tried to do was group all of the lessons that we learned across all of these examples that were based on the global south. And we found 3 buckets of change that were needed. So the first was on reimagining service provision. The second was including the excluded, and the third was enabling change. In the first case, we're talking about infrastructure design and delivery and service provision models. And including the excluded, data collection practices are a key component, as well as addressing issues of informal urban employment, which actually generates an awful lot of the employment in many of the cities in the global south. And then in enabling change, financing and subsidies, urban land management and governance and coalitions that I'll also speak about. So I'll quickly go through each of these and then go more in depth in the discussions on data and governance and coalitions. As Liz mentioned, networks and partnerships are really key for making sure that data, as well as other sort of key components that go into policy, are shared in a transparent way, and so that folks have the skills as well as access to the information. So when we talk about infrastructure design and delivery, we're talking about prioritizing the vulnerable, minimizing carbon lock-in, and anticipating future risks. Here, among the risks that we think about are flooding risks. And we've got examples in each of the cities, in each of the transformations of cities that have addressed these risks in different ways. So when we talk about infrastructure design and delivery, we talk about Durban, Rosario in Argentina, Bangkok as cities that have sort of address this issue in some way. When we talk about city provision models, we're talking about integrating alternative services in the short term with new partnerships for joint service delivery, sort of so that you can actually increase access. We start in the situation where generally informal providers are ignored. move to the next step of recognizing them, and lastly, integrating them. And we know that there have been cities around sort of around the world that have incorporated informal providers. For example, in Nairobi, city utilities providers are working with community organizations to run water kiosks so that allow for access sort of for all. When we include the excluded, we start with the idea that despite the data revolution, cities are really missing more granular local data in general on the city often when you've got national data, but also on who the vulnerable are, where they are, and how they live. Oftentimes, these folks are invisible, and the informal economy is sort of one example of that invisibility, right? We've got 2 billion workers that are in the informal sector, and we know that many of these are women, and that much of the work that's done just isn't recognized by official sources. So we need to think about alternative kinds of data collection and usage. And here are a couple of examples in data collection of new technologies, partnerships, and community engagement can help generate that local better data for decision-making and improve governance. This is a map of the metropolitan area in Mexico City and looking at accessibility and access to formal jobs. So at the same time, so in number 4, we recognize that recognizing and supporting informal workers is really important. And while I keep saying the word recognize, and this is where I think citizen science and local driven data can really help, that often folks in whole areas of cities are just erased and not included in maps. When we talk about enabling change, financing and subsidies, higher investment with targeted subsidies, sort of what we talk about, this is a little drawing of the conversion of an informal settlement from an underserved to a better served with specific elements that can be undertaken to improve the area, sort of on the urban land management side. When we talk about financing and subsidies, actually Mexico, the PROTRUM program is one of the examples that we talk about where we see national level money enabling local action. And that's something that linkage among those different levels of government sort of shows up when we're talking about coalitions of actions and alignment of national and local policies. When actors aren't aligned, the city suffers from conflicting agendas, conflicting goals, uncoordinated investment, inefficiency, and short-lived change. And one of the things that we noted is that we often see sort of the change that happens for the photo op, but it isn't necessarily sustained. And that's one of the areas where coalitions with community engagement can really help sustain sort of that change. In each of these cases, we come up with an action plan with specific actions that can be taken by different actors. So for city government and urban sector specialists, another group is national government. A third is civil society, including NGOs, experts, and researchers. The fourth is the private sector, and the fifth is the international community, including development finance institutions. And so what I will do right now is go through 2 of these different transformations, the most important that I think for the topic today in terms of data and then governance and coalitions, and show you sort of very, very quickly what some of the kinds of information that we have in terms of the actions. But I realized that I will not have time to go through all of them. So in some cases, I will move very, very quickly through the slides, just so that you know that they're there, so that I can close at the end with showing some of the resources that we have online and where you can find more information. So in the case of the transformations, what we do is we start with this status quo, and we talk then about where we'd like to go to. So the status quo is on the left-hand side in gray. The desired outcome of where we want to go to is in purple, sort of on the right. And we know that we often have ineffective decision-making that excludes the most vulnerable. And we want to move towards sound, inclusive policies with higher accountability. And this is one of the areas where citizen science can help tremendously, so that we can use new technologies and partnerships for better data and more granular local insights. excuse me, we can increase city capacity to collect and effectively utilize data, and we can co-produce and share data to foster more effective and inclusive governance. Now, in each of these cases, there are many things that need to be done, and if only one sector or one actor changes, you can get some change, but the real power comes when multiple actors work together to achieve this. So when we think about using new technologies and partnerships for better data and more granular local insights, and in each of these cases, you'll see a specific city example. So in this case, there was a large project that was done by an academic organization to map informal settlements in Bangalore using satellite imagery and machine learning that was combined with ground truthing. So the university then worked with community groups, and they found more than 2,000 informal settlements in the city, while government records showed fewer than 600. Secondly, the second priority action is to increase city capacity to collect and effectively utilize data, because we know that official statistics tend to underestimate urban poverty in most low and middle income nations, and therefore in the cities that they're in as well. So Paulo established a collaborative lab, the Mobile Lab, with transport professionals, computer and data scientists to support city agencies in analyzing transport data and travel patterns to inform decision-making. We'll hear about sort of other work in Brazil sort of later in the presentations. And then thirdly, a third priority action is to co-produce and share the data to foster more effective and inclusive governance. And here again, so there was community mapping in Nairobi, mapping over 50,000 households, identifying their priorities so that the real needs could be targeted and to better lobby the companies to provide better service. And as I mentioned, in each of these cases, we have these sort of specific actions that can be undertaken by different kinds of actors. So I'll go through this one just as an example. So this is city government and urban sector specialists can build capacity by bringing together these different sources of data, can utilize advanced technologies, but I'd also say in addition to the advanced technologies, you want to use traditional technologies and engage community actors in producing and sharing data, and then work to democratize data access to support citizen participation in policymaking to help build trust and to diagnose gaps in government action so that policies can be better targeted. One of the things that I mentioned earlier, and I think that Liz mentioned, and that I'm sure that we'll hear in the examples, is that we really do need the city and city officials to be open to sharing the data and to working with others to use that data sort of effectively, and that often is a challenge. So then we have sort of the work for the national government, for civil society, and some of the specific kinds of things that civil society can do, as well as the private sector and the international community. And I hope that all of you have a chance to take a look at these in more depth later. I've included them in here so that you can take a look at them. On governments and institutions, we do the same thing, talking about the need to form and support coalitions of local actors with access to decision-making, create incentives, resources, and mandates for policy alignment and collaboration. And here we can see, I just like to point out that when we talk about these diverse coalitions of local actors with access to decision-making, that the case studies that we had in Guadalajara, Pune, and Kampala show how civil society working with small business and key government officials actually made some changes to improve aspects of service provision. And then in the creating incentives, resources, and mandates for policy alignment on how Brazil's national law on urban mobility required municipalities to adopt certain kinds of plans, and cities couldn't access the funding that went along with that without those plans. So then we've got these tables again that are useful, but I mainly wanted to get to this point of looking at the sort of where you can find the information. Citiesforall.org is the short version. This is the longer version that will bring you right to the place, and we'll see if it will let me sort of show you this. And this is the website where you can get all this information, the synthesis report, the framing paper, the thematic working papers, the case studies, and other videos and other information right now for the synthesis report. It's just available in English, but it should be available soon in Portuguese, Spanish, and Chinese. And the executive summaries for each of the papers are already available in Spanish and Portuguese on the website. Finally, I just want to say that the image that we have here that we're using is from Pachuca in Mexico and shows an effort that was done in an informal settlement to change its image and present a better image that we then hope would attract attention so that services in service provision could be improved. So thank you. My email is on the first slide, and I'm happy to answer questions now as well as into the future. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a Robin y a Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Robin and Elizabeth. Now we are going to continue with the opinions and comments. Itza Castañeda is going to help us with that. Go ahead, Itza. Hello, good morning, everybody. I see that we have 44 people, 44 participants in this seminar. I'm very happy to know that we have more participants now. I would like to start by congratulating Robin and Elizabeth for their presentations. To communicate the results of research and papers is extremely important. Thank you very much both for sharing this information with us that in turn are an inspiration for us to continue doing research and working. We have a question for Elizabeth, and it has to do with a topic that you both talked about, and that is, in the case of Elizabeth, how do you think the cultural barriers have an impact on including gender or more females in citizen involvement? I mean, what was the impact that cultural barriers had on the inclusion of female citizens? The same question goes to Elizabeth and to Robin. Elizabeth, please go ahead.
Sure, thanks. It's a great question. So I think as Robin was referring, all across the globe, there are hidden and underserved communities that just don't get the attention. And especially around air pollution, researchers have really been able to document that in many cases, poor and marginalized communities are the ones that are disproportionately being impacted by air pollution. Especially when you look at women, the vast majority of research is really focused on their exposure to indoor air pollution sources, especially cooking stoves or cooking fuels. This is an incredibly important source of air pollution and exposure to women, but women do more than cook in and stay in the home. As people are moving around the city or around where they live, they are being exposed to multiple sources of pollution. And it's important to really unpack and understand the entire picture of where different people are being exposed and the impacts that they might be facing from those different exposures. For example, in many countries, it's not uncommon for people to sell goods by the side of busy roads. That is a huge source of exposure to vehicle pollutants and could easily be having very serious health impacts on the people that are staying and working in those stalls. When it comes to citizen science, I think it's really important to think through those issues when you're talking about who you're going to engage and how you're going to engage, so that you really have a clear understanding of where those cultural barriers lie, as well as the sort of gendered perspective, the stereotypes, the ability of women to participate in everyday life and in decision-making around policies, so that you can account for those. It's hard to be specific because obviously it will vary by country, but going through that process, I think, is really very important, especially because for most of the initiatives that I looked at, a lot of the citizen science engagement was coordinated by either very large national civil society organizations or very elite civil society organizations. So just the fact that you had some citizens involved still doesn't automatically mean that you're going to be reaching the most marginalized and ignored, underserved communities. So I think just really making sure that thinking through those issues as part of your citizen science initiative planning and engaging with researchers to really understand what you can do in terms of data collection and monitoring to unpack all of that complicated interplay of exposure and what makes them susceptible and how they can adapt, as has that be part of your initiative, are really important questions to wrestle with.
So now I can try.
Muchas gracias, Elizabeth, te elaboraste muy bien. Robin.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Robin, go ahead, please, if you would like to add something.
Sort of to build on what Liz mentioned, I think that we need to remember that oftentimes, and she spoke mainly sort of at the national level, I'm talking mainly sort of at the city level, where there are differences among groups, even within a city, right? Or within cities across countries. And within those groups, and that can be geographically in terms of different neighborhoods. It can be different ethnic groups, gender, age, education, background, sort of all of those different things, which means that when we're thinking of the way that the city or the government at whatever level engages, we need to think very creatively. We need to think about ways to bring this engagement to where people live and where all of these different kinds of groups can actually participate. We know that sort of the traditional way of a public hearing in a big building, sort of in the middle of town, is often going to be held at a time when women especially are not going to be able to attend, or people that don't have the resources, or that might not feel that they belong, or they might not be allowed in by security guards often because they don't look the right way, right? They don't look like the right kinds of people to come into a meeting. And so thinking about many different ways that engagement can happen. And so that can be surveys, although when you think about surveys, you also need to think about the technical or technological biases from using certain kinds of techniques, right? If you're using telephone, a landline telephone, folks don't have landlines. If you're using something that's internet-based, not everybody has access. So I think that we need to think about all of those different pieces so that you can be disaggregated, you can be creative, and then allow more participation of these different kinds of groups.
De acuerdo, totalmente de acuerdo.
I fully agree with both of you. Thank you very much. I believe that we have another question for Robin. So this question says,
or citizen science to be included as a process in the collective data collection transformation.
Thank you for the question. I think that it is a challenge in a lot of places because so citizen science and participatory processes in general often don't have the status of official data. And so it's one of the reasons why I think it's so important that we work across multiple actors to have everybody realize the potential of this approach to data collection and have it be viewed as legitimate. And that requires a change in attitude, that requires a change in laws, often, as well as processes. So all of those things need to coordinate, and often it implies some kind of funding that is provided by the government too, so that the government views this as something that is valid and something that they need to depend upon.
Can I also just add that I think looking at citizen science just as a narrow data collection initiative is really takes away from so many of the other benefits that my research was really able to unpack, both in terms of developing relationships with policymakers, helping to really understand what the community concerns were, those those networks and coalition buildings and expanding the public's really deepened understanding of air pollution, as well as the sort of way that policy needs to be informed, both in terms of how you define the problem, to how those solutions are socialized across the different actors, to how you monitor and evaluate what success looks like. So I think the other important part of that is to really think of citizen science as more than a narrow form of data collection, and really value and leverage the different other aspects of it to really enhance what you can get out of it, plus the data, because the data is still important. It's just not all there is.
Muy buen punto, Liz.
Thank you very much for your remark, Liz. Robin also made a comment saying that this data collection goes beyond the simple data collection. I have another question for you, Elizabeth, that is linked to what you just mentioned. How can the citizen science can contribute to develop policies and not to only stay at the level of data collection? How can we scale it in order, or scale it up in order to help us to define policies, public policies?
So I think that policy formation is a very long process, multi-step process, and sort of having the citizen engagement and sort of it being that mechanism for expanding the creative participation that I think Robin was referencing so well is really an important use of citizen science initiatives. The forums that were created that allowed policymakers to have conversations with citizens about what their concerns were, have a place to really explain why maybe the bad smell is not the best indicator of how polluted the air is, and that there might be other sources that they should be concerned about and trying to mitigate their exposure to. But also from the other perspective, I think that it's really important to recognize that violations, even if they can't take action based on the data, a number of the citizen science initiatives that were focused on specific point sources were able to say, hey, when we did our monitoring, we found that these pollutants were above regulatory limits. We found these associations with specific health impacts. And because of the relationships they were able to develop in the forums with policymakers, it really created a lot of pressure on both the polluting companies as well as the policymakers to take action. It was just simply more difficult for them to ignore, and they really, so you saw quite a number of outcomes that were really about enforcement and compliance. And I think having civil society and citizen engagement as a bottom-up accountability mechanism to really hold policymakers important is another really important aspect of citizen science that shouldn't be discounted.
Muchas gracias. En el mismo sentido, Robin.
Thank you very much. In that very same sense, Robin, I would like to ask you about your presentation. I mean, what you present talks about the favorable situations and the obstacles that you were able to get out of this research. Can you elaborate on the facilitators or the obstacles that you found so that citizen science is more commonly used, or that it is scaled up in order to help for policy formation? What are the obstacles and facilitators? Thank you.
Confuse the translators, the interpreters, sorry. As I think, yes, our work really tries to highlight obstacles and enablers sort of throughout sort of all of the various changes that we call for. And in terms of bringing citizen science in, I think that it is some of the points that I had mentioned earlier. I think there's an issue of attitude, and and those attitudes need to change. And where things worked often was when you had one person in the government that had a more open attitude and that was willing to see citizens and community groups and academics that were working on things as allies and not just as sort of enemies and sort of the folks to be avoided. And so those attitudes, I think, are very important. Secondly, the legal structure to allow this kind of data to be considered sort of as valid often is an issue in some places where official census data or other government data sort of somehow is prioritized or is viewed as the only kind of data that can be drawn on for a policy decision. And third, tying into the question about scaling, making sure that there are opportunities in the policy process for these kinds of efforts to be included, and changing the default from it being a rarity to it being the requirement and not having it as the exception, I think is another way to think about moving this forward and to overcome those obstacles.
Muchas gracias. Yo les quiero invitar a las y los participantes.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite all participants to pose additional questions or remarks or suggestions. We are about to wrap up this session and to continue with the second section of this event. If there are no further questions, I have an additional comment. I know that we have some people from Mexico among the participants, and some participants are from Latin America. And for the people that are from different continents, I would like to let you know that recently the Escazú agreement was signed. This agreement is on access to information and the right to participate on information. So I believe that nowadays in Mexico, Latin America, and the Caribbean, we have a binding document that reinforces citizen science, that reinforces the right to have access to information, and that we have to use it. We have to empower this tool. And this topic, I believe this topic goes hand in hand with what with this technical session. That was only a comment that I wanted to make. We have an additional question from Ethan. I don't know if it's for both of you. I believe that is for both of you.
You want to go first, Liz?
Sure.
Many times these projects are led by a few people who dedicate personal time for years. How can these efforts obtain funding to last long enough to effect change?
It's a really important question because obviously resources to do these kind of initiatives and then spend the time to really focus on how to translate the data into action is a long-term process. You definitely have seen a growing commitment in the United States and in Europe to fund these kind of citizen science initiatives. And I think expanding the money that those countries are making to do more initiatives in low and middle income countries, as well as working with government and funders in low and middle income countries to really expand the opportunity and to communicate the need for long-term funding so that once the data has been collected, the project doesn't end, I think are important mechanisms that would help expand and strengthen the resources that are available. Robin?
Yeah, I think that making it a legal part of the process, right? So that it's a requirement. Then if it's a part of a requirement, that will generate the need for the government to actually support it. And one other thing I think that's very important is to make sure that the government sort of sees this data as worthwhile archiving and keeping so that it just doesn't disappear, which is another problem that often happens. But I do think just making it part of the legal process is the best way and the most sustainable way to make it go forward. Thank you.
Pues muchísimas gracias. Vamos a dar
Thank you
cierre.
very much. So we're going to wrap up the first section of this event. My takeaway is comprised by many lessons. Firstly, we need to work on the legal and regulatory framework so that our work can transcend. That's, of course, going to be a challenge, but in the case of Mexico, in Latin America, this is going to lay the foundation so that we can step on the foundation to make this happen. So thank you very much, Robin and Elizabeth, for your presentations, and thank you to the entire team. So let's move on to the second section. Thank you. Thank you very much, Itza, for this moderation. And thank you guys for your responses. Now let's move on to the second section, from research to practice. So now let's move on to Luis Antonio, okay? Hello, everyone. Good morning. Okay, so yes, I want to talk to you about the two collaborations with WRI that we've had at the municipality of León. Firstly, we talked about pollutants and we analyzed them with low-cost sensors, and we wanted to determine the degree of exposure of citizens that do daily activities like walking, riding their bikes. So what we did was implement or install these sensors at different geographical points in order to determine to how many pollutants we are exposed. So we installed 3 mobile sensors, and some of them were also fixed. There were 6 fixed sensors in different points of the city, and the purpose was the same, to determine the pollution level. And the 3 mobile sensors were uh, transported by foot or by riding a bike. So what did we do? What we did was build the sensors, calibrate them, and we compared the data that the sensors provided to the data that another center was providing. You can see here the areas that we tracked. Those are the bike routes that we followed, and those are the central areas that we covered. This is a neighborhood of the city, so we focused on downtown. And during the period of time of the project, we proposed using the public bike system, especially in the center of the city. So this is another project, and we aimed at promoting the use of bikes. And we also wanted to determine how much pollution was affecting this area. And the impact was quite high, especially in the perimeter that you see highlighted, because in those areas, there is high activity, high entrepreneurial or industrial activity, and there are many public transportation routes, and a lot of products, especially shoes, are sold there. So this is a very crowded place where business activities are conducted and where people go to in order to buy products. So this is a heavily polluted area as a result. So those fixed sensors I talked about were installed in different points. The first one was installed at the Technological Institute of León. This is a school, and in front of this school, there is a street, which is like a main avenue, and it is a very crowded place because people go out of the schools and people pick up students. The second spot was a church called San Francisco de Asís, and it is very visited, especially over the weekends, because people go to the squares, people go to church on Sundays. So that's why we installed those sensors at the gardens in front of the church. There is also another place which is called San Juan de Dios and Arco de la Calzada, which is in downtown. And a lot of visitors go to these places. So we wanted to know how much these people were exposed to pollutants in those touristic areas. Then we went to the boulevard, which is one of the main avenues of León, and a lot of traffic is seen, especially during peak hours. So there we gathered very interesting data in terms of the pollutants, and we also went to the Parque Mexico, and we obtained information on the vehicles that go through the boulevard, for example. In the case of the park, we wanted to determine how much we were exposed to pollutants when going for a jog or when going for a run or when performing any physical activity. We saw that we are not as exposed as we thought we were, but there are some places in which the pollution level went up tremendously. So that's what we got. So this is one of the pathways that we followed by foot. You can see the routes over here. The areas highlighted in black represent the areas that are most heavily polluted. You can see there is an avenue, which is the Avenue Miguel Alemán, and we found out through this project that this avenue is very polluted because many activities are conducted in that avenue. So there are urban buses that go through this street pretty much throughout the entire day. So they emit pollutants, and there are also lateral lanes that have a lot of vehicles passing by. There is also great economic activity. As I was telling you, there are also informal stands that sell different products, and they also pollute tremendously. So yes, this is a topic that needs to be regulated, and we need to start pushing for the implementation of policies. There are areas that are very polluted. You can see that area highlighted in black. And one of the roads was being refurbished. There was some work in the road. So that's why there were many particles that were being put into the atmosphere there. So yes, that provided the foundation for us to push for action. And we realized that the repairment or like the fixing of roads pollutes a lot. So perhaps we can push for the government to ban this type of work when people are performing different activities during the day or when they are passing by. So that's what we wanted to achieve with the first project, with the installation of the sensors. And then we had another project, which was about strengthening the capacities for using forecasts in order to promote the tools for assessing air quality in order to protect the health of the population in León. So that was the main goal. We wanted to use this data so that the tool can be appropriately used. So one of the findings that we gathered was that there are some areas that are at risk. WRI provided great support while performing this project. So we had a map that was arranged or classified based on demographic density, and
Un
we can
minuto, por
see
favor.
the areas that are heavily polluted. And as you can see, those are the areas in which we were able to conduct specific actions and where we were able to push for the creation of policies. Here in this image, you can see how we conducted the forecast. You can see the particles there. And what are the final thoughts that we had? Those are presented in this presentation. We realized that daily activities make us get exposed to pollutants, and thanks to the maps that we drafted, we are able to take specific actions in specific areas and target those areas specifically. Thank you very much, Luis Antonio. Now let's move on to Estefany Lopez presentation, who is the Director of Air Quality Management at the Ministry of the Environment and Territorial Development. And she's going to talk about the situation in Guadalajara throughout many sectors.
Muy bien, bueno, pues este tema del que les voy a platicar
Okay,
ahorita
so the topic that we're going to delve into is closely related to the project that WRI was spearheading with the ecologist collective here in Guadalajara, and it's very similar to the project that my colleagues from Guanajuato did. They used low-cost sensors of the University of Edinburgh. However, I'm going to talk about the participation side or the participation perspective in these types of projects. And this is relevant because we, as part of the state, have taken part in different monitoring projects with the support of different ministries or organizations, for example, the Institute for the Fight Against Climate Change. And we've also collaborated with different service stations. We've also collaborated with people who use timber in order to perform their day-to-day activities. In this case, we didn't only go to people who are exposed to pollutants, but we also collaborated with WRI and with the Ecologist Collective, which is a civil society organization that has a long-standing expertise on these matters, on air quality and on different projects, and they are able to take up different projects that have an impact on a wide audience. And we can see how these initiatives have high impact on the present of these communities. Guadalajara is one of the most polluted cities in Mexico. However, the population sometimes doesn't really have awareness about this. The citizens don't really think that the air quality is poor. However, there are some pieces of data that are quite alarming. There are pollution levels that go beyond the rules or like the accepted standards. So that's why it's important to not only have an international framework, but also a local framework that tells us what we can do with information gathered as part of these projects. So as I told you earlier, we collaborated with WRI, with the Ecologist Collective, with Plan, and the Ministry of the Environment. So the first activities we conducted were the following. Once León was finishing the campaign, some of my colleagues from the Ministry of the Environment on May in 2019 traveled to León in order to find out about these sensors and the devices they were using, and they wanted to know how those devices could be operated. They wanted to learn more about the fixed sensors and about the mobile sectors sensors. And they wanted to know how these pollution levels were fluctuating in different points. So that's what was done at the beginning. We took a look at those sensors and we compared the monitoring sensor results to the results that one of the stations was providing. And we made sure that the devices were operating correctly in different stations, and we wanted to have a wide array of pollutants being assessed. So that's why we used reference devices or equivalent devices in one of the stations. So we extracted the information for over a month, and we started to get the results and compare them. Then we took the results to the WRI team so that they could send this data to the Edinburgh University. Later on, we installed the sensors in Guadalajara, especially in downtown, and we saw the way in which we could install those sensors in the most crowded areas. So we worked with IMEPLAN and with WRI to analyze the distances of the avenues, the places or the spots where the sensors were supposed to be installed, especially in parks. So we had weekly reviews or assessments of these devices. After installing these devices, we had a training session with the Green College or the Green School, and we talked about how those sensors were supposed to be used. And we also trained the participants on how they can get the information, what are the routes that they have to go through. We also told them which pathways they needed to take by foot. And we engaged different people from different schools, from Guadalajara, from the Ecologist Collective, and we also used couriers. And they used a bike system in order to do their trips by bike, and they also had other trips by foot. So we started comparing the differences between walking and riding a bike. Many people were involved and many stakeholders as well. People from Semadet were very interested in knowing what was happening at the sensor level. So by mid 2020, we finished the trips and we also gathered the information from the devices. So what were the findings? Let me move on to the next slide. This is another project that we conducted in Jalisco. It is called ARED, and we obtained all the information from the sensors that allowed us to see where are the areas that are most at risk. So in which areas can we maybe contract a disease related to air pollution? In the first project, the processing of the data was performed by the Edinburgh University, and we also had the support of WRI and the support of the Ecologist Collective. They helped us process the data because
Un minuto, por
we
favor.
wanted to define, you have 1 minute. Okay, thank you. We wanted to know where should we mobilize public transportation, because in some avenues, public buses were running around, and in those areas, the concentration of pollutants was way higher than in other areas. And most of these avenues were wider than other smaller cities. So that's how we defined the areas where we see high levels of pollution. And this information can be extrapolated to other areas, for example, to the mobility ministry, so that that department can make decisions on how they can direct different vehicles or in which places the use of bikes should be promoted. And as I told you earlier, the most heavily polluted area is downtown. So that was very interesting to see. I also want to share with you that we're still conducting these kinds of analysis. So there are a lot of areas of opportunities in terms of these projects because we want students to use sensory information. And there are sensors in these areas, especially in the central part of the city. So yes, this is a very interesting project. That's all from my side. Thank you very much. Thank you, Fanny. Thank you, Luis, for sharing this application of participatory science on measurement campaigns. Later on, as I told you earlier, we're going to share all the presentations. So lastly, we have Ariadne Samios, who is a coordinator of active mobility at WRI Brazil. She's going to share her experiences in the project that she conducted, and she's going to talk about the community projects in Sao Paulo. She has conducted different awareness and emission sources projects. Okay, so I give you the floor, Ariadne.
So hi everyone, thank you also for the invitation for presenting our work. As Ana said, I am Ariadne Samios. I work in WRI Brazil in the active mobility team. I will present the work we did in the educational territories in São Paulo. So just to give a brief context of this project, this is in 2018, the municipality of São Paulo developed municipal plan for the early childhood to contribute to the development of children between 0 and 6 years old. And among the initiatives of this plan was the investment in the educational territories program. That was a program that aimed to develop vulnerable areas of the city for children. So they selected 13 areas, peripheral areas of the city, to work on different subjects as road safety, public spaces, social participation, and subjects that could impact the quality of life of these children and their families. And since 2019, we have been supporting the city on the development of this program, but in 2020, we could create a more robust project to support the program with the support from Bernabé Foundation. Just to explain a little bit of the project itself, we could support the municipality in several areas of this program. One of them was the air quality monitoring, but we could also support the development of urban projects, pilot interventions, workshops for engagement of the population and the activation of these territories, an observatory of early childhood where they could measure different indicators of the early childhood development, and also a monitoring tool for school routes. We developed this project since April 2020 until December of last year. I will present the activities we did on the first component, that is the air quality one. We developed this component mainly from June 2021 until the end of the last year. So in this component, we had three main objectives. The first one was to measure and monitor levels of PM 2.5 in 5 territories. So from that 13 territories, we choose 5 to work with. We monitor the levels of pollution in external and internal environments of schools. And also in 4 of those territories, we could identify the chemical composition of the fine and coarse matter. The second objective of this component was to provide information for those communities, vulnerable communities. So we developed a booklet with actions and information regarding air pollution and air quality. And the third objective was to raise awareness for the communities. And then, to that, we work with 2 schools. I'm not a specialist in air quality, so I'll talk mostly of the process of this whole project and what was some learnings that we had in the end. So I'll not talk that much about the results we had regarding air quality. So here, just that you can see which territories were monitored. It's all vulnerable areas. They are all located in the peripheral areas of the city, all low-income areas. These ones that are outlined in blue were the ones that we could also monitor the chemical composition of the pollution that was monitored. Here is how we monitor the levels of PM 2.5. So We did that with low-cost air beam sensors. As I said before, they were installed inside and outside the classrooms. We can see here on these pictures. This was important to compare the levels of pollutions outside and inside, and if the children, they were being exposed in higher levels of pollution also inside the classrooms. And here on the low picture here, you can see which was the equipment that was used to identify this chemical composition of the fine and coarse particulate matters. Here, one thing that we can present as a main challenge of this process of monitoring these territories is the cooperation of a school to install these sensors, because as these were vulnerable areas with a lot of presence of traffic, drug trafficking and drug trafficking leaders, some of the schools, they had a fear of installing this kind of equipments, because these territories, they are fear of being observed by the government or having their activities observed. So we had to explain to that those sensors, they could not capture any images of the territory. The information that we're capturing, they were only regarding the air quality. So this is one of the main challenges of the process. And the second one was the infrastructure of these schools, because they were all public schools, and some of them had not connection of Wi-Fi. When they had, the Wi-Fi was unstable, and we had to go very often to the school to restart the sensor. So those were some of the challenges of working with vulnerable communities. Just some main findings of this monitoring is that in 5 territories, the concentration of the pollution was above the limit established by the World Health Organization. Also in 2 of the territories, we identified that inside the classrooms, in some part of the days, the concentration of the pollution was even higher than outside. So the children were exposed to even higher levels of pollution inside the classrooms. This was mainly due because of the position of windows and doors of the classrooms, and also the peak of the PM 2.5 concentration. Okay, they were also reflected in the internal classrooms. So the second objective was to inform the communities. So we developed some booklets of air quality with accessible information. I'll just pass very quickly to what were the topics that we worked in this booklet. After this was translated to English, but it was first developed in Portuguese. And here is just, we elected some actions that could be taken by groups of actors, but individual actors too, and the schools as well, to prevent the exposure of children to air pollution. And then the third objective was to raise the awareness of the importance of air quality and the theme itself. So we work with 2 schools in 2 territories that were also monitored. And some of the activities that we could do with the children and also the caregivers was to present the actions of the booklet, explain for the children what were the pollution sources in a playful way. They could identify some polluting vehicles and not polluting vehicles. In this school, they had a very strong presence of bus in the street just in front of the school, so the children could also identify pollution sources on their way to school and on the school surrounding. And just to finishing, I think just some takeaways of all this process is that working with vulnerable areas and informal settlements, we are faced with specific challenges that is good if they are identified before, so we can have success of this initiative. Also, it is important to make the population aware of issues that are relevant to their quality of life as air quality, and working with groups that are already organized as school communities makes it easier to introduce these themes. And also children, they have this role of bringing these issues inside their homes, talking with their parents about the problems. And the third one is that sharing the information and the results of the monitoring, for example, empowers these communities to demand solutions from the government also to act inside their possibilities. And just to highlight one example of that is that in one of the schools, they identify that there was a land that was empty just beside the school, where the community used that land to just burn garbage and deploy garbage in that place. And the school worked to revamp and qualify this land, so it was not a source of pollution that was really close to the school anymore. So I think that's it. If you have any question, just please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Ariadne, por compartirnos.
Thank
estas
you very
experiencias.
much, Ariadne, for sharing with us your experience in Brazil. And let's have our final reflections to close our fourth technical seminar. Due to time restriction, we won't have time to have the Q&A session, but I'll pass the floor to Betty in order to wrap up this technical session. I'll pass the floor to Betty.
Muchas gracias. Pues bueno, por tiempo,
Thank you very
solamente
much. Due to
quisiera
time
unirme
restrictions,
a lo
what I
que
would like to
Ceci ya ha
do
mencionado, que
is
agradecemos
to
su
thank
participación,
your
pues como
participation
speakers, como también
as
como
speakers
participantes. Creo
and
que el día de hoy
participants.
tuvimos
I
unas
believe that
excelentes
today
presentaciones.
we
Primero,
have
de esta
excellent
visión de qué
presentations
se sabe con proyectos de investigación
on
sobre ciencia
what
participativa.
we know
Y después escuchar de
from
3 casos en Sao
research on
Paulo, en
citizen
Guadalajara y en León,
science, and we also
cómo
heard from
realmente
3 cases in Sao
sí
Paulo,
puede aplicarse
Guadalajara,
la ciencia
León,
participativa, la
and
ciencia
how
ciudadana.
we can
Creo que
have
es
an
algo que ya también
impact on
mencionaba Robin, ¿no?
participatory
Que los
science and
datos
citizen
son
science.
importantes
Something that we have
y no
mentioned so
necesariamente a
far
veces
is that
tendremos que
data
hacerlos
are
oficiales. Ojalá
important,
lleguemos también a
and
ese tema
they are
de
not
tener una
necessarily official
estructura
right now.
legal o
Hopefully,
normativa en que estos
we
datos puedan ser
will have a legal
utilizados.
structure so
Pero
that
creo que
these
con los
data become
ejemplos que
official and
tuvimos
can
hoy,
be
pues
used.
pudimos ver
But based on the
perfectamente
examples that
cómo
we've
estos
seen
datos
today,
que se
we can
colectan incluso
understand
en proyectos
perfectly
muy
how
cortos
these
pueden ser
data that are used
utilizados
in very short
perfectamente
projects
para
can be
identificar
perfectly
fuentes, para
used in order to have an impact
hablar
on
sobre la
sources,
sensibilización,
to talk about
cómo podemos
raising
estar expuestos a
awareness,
fuentes de
and to
emisión,
talk
a qué
about how
contaminantes.
we are
Lo más importante es
exposed
motivar acción.
to
Con
emission
esto creo
sources.
que
So
invitamos
the most
a
important
todos y
thing is
todas
to
a que nos
motivate
manden sus
participation and
comentarios, sus
involvement. I would
preguntas
like to
y
invite
que
all of you
nos
to
acompañen
send
en la
your
próxima
questions,
sesión de
suggestions, and
instalaciones
comments,
técnicas.
and don't forget to
Bueno,
join us in
esperamos
our
tener
next
todavía
technical
más
section. And
casos
we hope
exitosos
to
como los que
have
escuchamos hoy.
more
Creo que con
successful
esto, Ceci,
cases like the
por
ones that we
tiempo,
heard
pues
today.
a lo mejor les pedimos a todos abran
Without
su
any
cámara
further
y podamos
ado,
tomar una
we would
foto,
like
¿cierto?
you
Muchas
to
gracias.
ask everybody to turn on your camera so that we can have the picture taken. So please, can you turn on your camera so that we can have our group picture taken? Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much to our speakers. We hope that this was a very rich session for everybody. And we'll keep in touch in order to continue creating this community. See you in our next technical seminar session. Thank you very much.